Ethics and other normative areas. One way to get a better grasp of ethics is to look at its family members, other normative areas that are related to them. Now, ethics is a normative area. That means it deals with norms, which is a way of saying that it deals with values. And these other normative areas, they overlap with ethics, and again, they're sort of like family members. So just as you would learn more about a person by meeting their family, one can learn more about ethics by meeting the normative family. Now, for each of these areas, we can look at how they assess, the terminology. We can also look at the basis of the normativity, what grounds the assessment, and common punishments and rewards in each areas. Because normative areas are all about assessing and all about punishing and sometimes rewarding. So first with ethics, the assessment terms are always easy. We assess in terms of right and wrong, good and bad, virtue and vice. In terms of the basis, well, philosophers have argued for centuries about this. Some say ethics is grounded in conscience. Some say reason. Some say self-interest. Some say social agreement. Some say nature. Some say we're just making this stuff up. Now, in terms of punishments and rewards, again, this is all over the place. In some cases, people may feel some guilt at being bad or peace of mind at being good. They might gain a good reputation for doing good things or a bad reputation for doing bad things. There can be, as Plato argued, sort of intrinsic rewards to being good. That virtue, as some say, is its own reward, and evil its own punishment. But with ethics, the basis and punishment and reward are all over the place. It all depends on the theory you're looking at. Now, maybe religion can help us a bit here as well. Now, religion also involves, of course, assessment. There is, on the plus side, the righteous. On the minus side, the sinful. On the plus side, the holy. On the minus side, the unholy. And blasphemy and heresy, etc. In terms of the basis, well, much like ethics, this is also all over the place. It all depends on who you're talking to. For those who believe in the divine or the infernal, it's real. For example, if someone believes in God, the basis of religion would be God. People who are atheist would generally say that religion is based on, say, religious authorities. They're just making stuff up and often trying to impose it on people. There are even those who have claimed, in some degree, that we have a genetic predisposition towards religious belief. And of course, our good dead friend Sigmund Freud had all kinds of stuff about how it's basically looking for a father figure. And so the basis of religion, again, all depends on who you talk to. Some would say real basis in divine or infernal beings. Others say we're just kind of making this stuff up. Same with punishments and rewards. It all depends on whether the religion's got it right or not. There can be, if there is, no supernatural entities, people, of course, can still feel guilt. They can face social punishment. They can also get social rewards and praise for being, righteous pillars of the community. Now, if divine and infernal beings do exist, then there can be punishment by divine agents or infernal agents, such as hell. There can be divine reward, such as heaven. And again, it all depends on what is real. Now, religion is often used as the basis of morality. It's not uncommon, to ask somebody, if you ask them, in all seriousness, what is the basis of your ethics? Many people will say their religion. And religion also has been subject to assessment by moral standards, where there are authors and critics who claim that religion is not only, not good, that it's actively bad. And there are others who take an opposite view, saying religion is really good by moral standards. And religion, of course, typically involves a moral aspect. It tells us what to do. Now, not surprisingly, there's a lot of overlap between religion and morality, because religion seeks to answer, in most cases, many moral problems, like how should you live your life, Who should you marry? What is acceptable behavior? What's unacceptable behavior? Etc. And of course, morality often covers the same things as religion. Now, one clear sort of overlapping area is a fairly famous moral theory called divine command theory, short DCT. This is the view that what is good because God commands it, and what is bad because God forbids it. So whatever God said is good because God says so. Whatever is bad because God says so. And it's a fairly popular moral view. Now, what about law and rules? Well, the assessment terms for law pretty straightforward. There is the legal, the illegal, and there is, crimes and stuff. What is the basis of law? Well, on the face of it, the obvious source of law is we make all this crap up. Someone down in the Capitol building, like here in Tallahassee or Washington, D.C., or Augusta, Maine, they're just making stuff up. And then people just say, okay, it's the law. But there is, as we'll see, there's a deeper question about the foundation of law. Punishment, pretty straightforward. Fines, prison terms, exile, death, torture, murder, inflicted by the enforcers of the law. There's usually not a lot of reward for not breaking the law. Usually it's mostly punishments. But occasionally I suppose there could be, positive rewards for following the law. Maybe like the Crime Stopper, tip lines where they have, reward for that. Now, law, as you might imagine, overlaps quite a bit with ethics. There's often moral criticism of laws, that laws can be immoral, and often are. You can look at the United States, currently and historically, and go through and find many laws that would be regarded on many systems of ethics as clearly immoral, clearly bad. Now, of course, there can be things that are moral that are quite illegal. Not surprisingly, countries that have bad laws can outlaw things that would be morally good. Now, there's also a long-standing tradition of basing many laws on morality. For example, if you look at laws against killing, stealing, that type of stuff, they're often also based on religion, but also have a moral foundation. Things we shouldn't do because they're bad. But that said, there are many immoral things that are obviously not illegal, and a good case can be made that there are many immoral things that shouldn't be illegal in a good system. So, for example, we may consider, cheating on one's boyfriend, girlfriend, etc. to be immoral, but we probably don't want the police, involved in enforcing that. Similarly, like lying to one's spouse, probably immoral, but unless it involves, something pretty serious, we would not want it to be something illegal, unless it's already, clearly like a criminal activity, like committing fraud and stealing all their money, for example. And so there's quite a bit of debate about how law and morality should interact. So law, not surprisingly, raises many moral issues all throughout history, and especially today, about how policing should work, how laws should work, what type of sentencing there should be, and we often critique the law from a moral standpoint. Now, one view in ethical theory is what's called legalism, sometimes known as legal positivism. It's the view that morality is determined by the law. On the plus side, it does solve the problem of, how do you know what's good and bad? You just look at the law. The minus side is an obvious problem, because if you look at any legal system, to just say, well, it's good because it's legal, that seems problematic, because then it takes away any real foundation for criticism. Etiquette. Etiquette is a normative area because it does involve telling people what they should and should not do. The assessment involves the polite, the impolite, the proper, the improper, the rude. The basis of this is all pretty straightforward. This is the easiest one to answer. It's all agreement and custom. and also authorities, mismanners, etc. In terms of punishments and rewards, typically pretty minor, unless, the violations head into law or ethics. Being rude often results in social disapproval, although sometimes some approval. And similarly, the rewards, being properly mannered, can result in some social approval. How does etiquette and ethics overlap? Well, you could make a case that it could be in some cases immoral to ignore etiquette or be rude. In some cases, things required by a particular etiquette in a culture might be immoral, perhaps. But etiquette, with all due respect to mismanners and others, is a fairly minor thing in terms of ethics, generally. Although a case can be made that it does connect to, obviously, treating people with respect. And respect is a form of, it does involve a degree of etiquette. Lastly is, of course, aesthetics. Aesthetics is a branch of philosophy that deals with art and beauty. The assessment involves, the most obvious one is art versus non-art. And much like ethics, it does involve the good and the bad. And of course involves the beautiful and the ugly. Now, very much like ethics, the basis of aesthetics varies a great deal. Just like ethics, it can be based in emotions, or social agreement, or, as Plato claimed, there can be an objective basis, that beauty can be a real thing. They're a real, super real thing, one of those forms. And so the basis of ethics and aesthetics are all over the place. Again, it all depends on what theorist you talk to. You can get everything from beauty is the eye of the beholder to beauty is a transcendent metaphysical form. Punishments and rewards in aesthetics. Well, punishments in art would typically be being rejected, being ignored, being criticized, unless, of course, it crosses over into, legal territory, like graffiti, or into moral territory, such as doing, art that involves, say, shooting people. Well, there was an artist, that may sound stupid, but there was an artist who had a piece called Shoot, where they would be shot with a .22 caliber pistol. So you can imagine that reversed, where you have like some artist who shoots somebody in the audience randomly, which would of course raise moral problems. In terms of reward, well, you can have acceptance, attention, and the obvious thing, if you're really successful, lucrative contracts and sales. Perhaps, being famous on the YouTubes, the Instagrams, or perhaps even the Teddygrams. So how does aesthetics and ethics overlap? Well, there is quite a bit of overlap, because aesthetics does raise a variety of moral issues. For example, one big one is censorship. That's both a matter in ethics and aesthetics. When is it okay to censor works of art? When is it okay for the state to do it? Should artists engage in a degree of self-censorship? Do they have a moral obligation to self-censor? And of course, there are other concerns about aesthetic freedom and also aesthetic content. For example, if you look back at typically older works, cartoons, books, movies, they can have very strong racist and sexist elements that were seen by much of the population as, normal back then. If you look at, some Disney classics, some Bugs Bunny cartoons, and various works of literature, there'll be just sort of casual racism and sexism just in the book. And that does raise the question, is it morally okay to leave those works as they are? Should they be sanitized? Should they be banned? Should there be warning labels? And on a related note, we also have, especially in light of the Me Too movement, we have concerns about the morality of artists. So if you have an actor who, committed various, misdeeds, terrible things, should that be taken as affecting the quality of their past works? Should you look at them in a different light because of their immoral behavior that we now know about? Should that affect the aesthetics of their past works? And so ethics and aesthetics, overlap quite a bit, much like paint on a canvas. So while all these areas, etiquette, law, aesthetics, religion, do overlap, it's important to keep them distinct. For example, being illegal does not automatically entail that something must be immoral, because there are things that are illegal, throughout history and now, that are not immoral. And of course, being immoral doesn't entail that something should automatically be illegal. And likewise, something could be moral. It does not need to entail that it automatically should be legal. And being legal does not entail that something should automatically be moral. Now, of course, there are theories that do allow for going from one area to another. And likewise for religion. So just because something's in a religion doesn't mean that it should be law and that it automatically is moral. And this requires, making an argument. We saw, some theories that do this, kind of automatically, like divine command theory, takes you right from religion to morality. Legal positivism or legalism takes you right from, law to morality. If you want to see more about how to, transition between different areas, I would recommend the ethics class. Next, we'll go on to look at a sort of a quick sprint through of some moral theories. We now look at some moral theories in alphabetical order. The first is Etiquette, or virtue theory. And on this view, the basis of moral assessment is character, virtues, and vices. So the focus is on the moral agent, the person, rather than the actions or consequences. Another broad area of moral view is what's called cognitivism in the context of ethics. This is the view that moral statements are either true or false. They don't just express feelings or emotions, and the truth or falsity of such statements is based on there being, properties, either moral properties directly or properties that are sort of indirectly moral properties. We talked a bit about relativism earlier, and one form of it is what is called cultural relativism. And this is a descriptive theory. It's anthropological rather than ethical. And it's simply the factual statement or factual view, observation, that different cultures have different moral principles. And its relevance to ethics is that it's often used to argue for moral or ethical relativism. So people often do is say, well, cultures have different moralities, therefore morality depends on the culture. We've also seen divine command theory, which is exactly what it sounds like. What the divine, typically God, commands is good. What the divine, typically God, forbids is evil. So basically, good and evil are set by what God says. And so morality would be based on religion. Now, a fairly broad area of ethics that encompasses multiple theories is what's called deontology. It comes from the word deon, which is Greek for duty. Not howdy doody or doggy duty, but duty as in obligation. And it's the view that certain features of actions are inherently wrong or right in and of itself. That an action can be just wrong or just right. Probably the most common version of deontology is what is called rule deontology. And that's a rule-following view of ethics. So actions are wrong if they break the correct moral rules. They're right if they conform to the correct moral rules. And if the rules don't cover it, then it's neutral. It's neither prohibited nor endorsed. So in this view, actions themselves have intrinsic value, positive or negative. Ethical egoism used to be a fairly side ethics, fairly minor. But thanks to the Tea Party movement that arose and many politicians on the right who explicitly embraced it, ethical egoism became more important. Now, sort of the foundation for ethical egoism is psychological egoism. And this is a descriptive theory in, well, psychology. And it's the view that as a matter of psychological fact, people act in what they see as their own best interest. Now, this is descriptive. It doesn't tell people what they should do. It just says this is what people are like. Now, people who are ethical theorists, often use that fact, or that claim, that people act in their own best interest, to provide the foundation for the moral view, the moral theory of ethical egoism. So psychological egoism is that people do act in their own best interest, and ethical egoism is that people should do this. So acting in your own best interest, or what you see as your own best interest, is morally right. Now, some critics of this take this to be just endorsing selfishness, just trying to take, the vice of selfishness and paint it up to look like virtue. Now, Ayn Rand, a fairly famous philosopher, explicitly embraced that idea that this is all about selfishness. In fact, she wrote a pretty well-known essay called The Virtue of Selfishness, in which she argues that what you should do is do what you see as being your best interest. Blatantly be selfish and reject altruism. Others, take a kinder, gentler approach and say, oh, no, we're not advocating selfishness. We're saying you should act in your own self-interest, but you shouldn't be selfish. Before Ayn Rand, the best-known ethical egoist was our good dead friend Thomas Hobbes, who advocated this view. So that's ethical egoism. And again, it's important today politically because part of the American political movement does explicitly take ethical egoism, specifically Ayn Rand, as a moral justification for their view as to how people should act. If you ever saw signs, back when there were Tea Party marches saying, who is John Galt, that's a reference to Ayn Rand. Now, we saw ethical relativism earlier, and it's the view that morality is not objective, and moral statements depend on the society or culture. So a moral claim is not true or false, objectively. Their trueness or falseness is relative to the culture. As I mentioned before, when in Rome, what the Romans say is good, and what they say is bad. But if you go somewhere else, it's different. One of the earliest and most famous relativists was our good dead friend Herodotus, who is also known by many as the father of history, the discipline, not history of writing stuff down. Also, far more contemporary, Gilbert Harman, who again, famous philosopher, but being a famous modern philosopher means you're really not famous at all. Another broad view of ethics is emotivism, and this is in opposition to cognitivism. It's the kind of the opposite. And so for the non-cognitivist, ethical statements are neither true nor false. They simply express attitudes and feelings. So for the non-cognitivist, if someone says stealing is wrong, they're basically saying stealing, yuck. Or if they say charity is good, they're kind of saying charity, smiley face, like. The famous emotivist is our A.J. Ayer. Again, famous philosopher. If you do a Google search on him, you'll find he's got a Wikipedia page. But pretty much everyone out of philosophy is not heard of him, because being a famous philosopher means really not being famous at all. Error theory. This, again, kind of goes against some of the underpinnings of cognitivism. And they make the following argument. Premise 1. If moral principles are objectively valid, there must be moral facts or properties. Premise 2. There are no moral facts or properties. Conclusion. There are no moral truths. So why do they call it error theory? Well, it is an error, they claim, to believe there are moral truths. Hence, error theory. So when we're talking about ethics, we're talking about nothing. The most famous of folks who believe this is J.L. Mackie. Again, famous philosopher means they're not famous at all. Hedonism. There's psychological hedonism, which you probably heard about maybe in a biology class or obviously psychology class, and this is a psychological hypothesis that what motivates people and other creatures is a desire for pleasure and aversion for pain. So creatures seek what they like, avoid what they don't like, which is a psychological thesis, not ethics. But people do, not surprisingly, say, hey, people like pleasure and they avoid pain, so let's make this into an ethical theory. So what's ethical hedonism? Well, it's the view that only pleasure has intrinsic positive value, and only pain has intrinsic negative value. And we'll see our good dead friend, John Stuart Mill, takes the view of ethical hedonism.